This is the mystery of what the Loch finally revealed. For centuries, it has held its secrets deep within its cold, peat-black waters. It has offered fleeting glimpses, shadowy figures on sonar, and inexplicable photographs, but never a body, never proof. Until the chilly mist-shrouded morning of October 28, 2021. The day began like any other for Angus MacLeod, a postman with the Royal Mail for over 30 years. His route was one of the most scenic and isolated in Scotland, winding along the B852 on the southern, less trafficked side of Loch Ness. It was a route he knew intimately. Every dip in the road, every gnarled oak that clung to the rocky shoreline, every cottage with a barking dog that awaited his red van. On that particular Thursday, a thick autumnal fog, known locally as the Har, was rolling off the water, blanketing the landscape in a soft, ethereal gray. The air was still and carried the scent of damp earth and decaying pine needles. Just south of the village of Foyers, there is a small, unnamed cove, a place locals occasionally use to launch small fishing boats. It is not a tourist spot. It is a working piece of shoreline, littered with smooth, dark stones and tangled driftwood. As Angus guided his van around a sharp bend, something caught his eye. A shape down by the water's edge. It was long and dark, an unnatural mass against the pale gray of the stones. His first thought was a fallen tree, perhaps dislodged by the heavy rains of the previous week. But there was a quality to it, a slumped, organic curvature, that made him slow the van to a crawl. He pulled over onto the muddy verge, the engine idling quietly. Curiosity piqued. He grabbed his phone and a heavy torch from the passenger seat and began the short, careful walk down the steep bank towards the shore. The fog was thicker here, swirling around his boots and muffling the sound of the loch's gentle lapping. As he got closer, a smell reached him. It was a rank, overpowering odor of decay, but with a strange, briny undertone, like rotting fish mixed with something else, something he could not place. It was a primal, unsettling scent that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He clicked on the torch, its powerful beam cutting a sharp white cone through the mist. He swept it across the shore, and then it fell upon the object. Angus stopped dead. His breath caught in his throat. This was no tree. Sprawled across the pebbled beach, half in and half out of the water, was the carcass of an enormous animal. It was immense, far larger than any native Scottish creature he had ever seen or imagined. He estimated its length at over 20 feet, though it was difficult to tell for sure given its position. The body was in a state of advanced decomposition, its skin sloughing off in places to reveal a pale, rubbery-looking blubber beneath. The skin that remained was a dark, mottled gray-green, almost reptilian in texture, and devoid of any hair or fur. At one end was a long, surprisingly slender neck, perhaps 6 or 7 feet in length, that lay unnaturally twisted back upon the torso. It ended in a small, compact head, mostly skeletal at this point, but with a distinctly serpentine or equine shape. The eye sockets were empty voids, and scraps of dark flesh still clung to the jawbone, which seemed to hold rows of small conical teeth, more suited for grasping fish than for tearing flesh. The main body, the torso, was bulky and barrel-shaped, a great mound of decaying matter from which the pungent smell emanated most strongly. Protruding from it were what looked like 4 large appendages. They were not legs in the conventional sense, nor were they the fins of a fish. They were broad and paddle-shaped, like giant fleshy oars, each at least 5 feet long. 2 were positioned near the front of the torso, and 2 further back, a classic plesiosaur-like arrangement that was impossible to ignore. A long, tapering tail extended from the rear of the body, disappearing into the dark water of the loch. Angus, a man of steady nerves, who had dealt with everything from washed-out roads to aggressive farm dogs, felt a tremor of pure shock run through him. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy. He had lived his entire life by the loch and had always dismissed the stories of a monster as tourist fodder. Charming nonsense for the gullible. Yet here, at his feet, was something inexplicable. It looked ancient, prehistoric. It was the monster from the legends, made real and terrible in death. His training, the ingrained procedure of his daily life, took over. He backed away slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers clumsy with cold and shock. He needed to document this. He took a photo, then another. He switched to video, his hand shaking as he panned the length of the creature, the torch beam illuminating the grotesque details. He narrated in a hushed, trembling whisper, "My God, it is. It is. Here. It is. Actually here. October 28th. Just south of Foyers. It is. It is. Huge." He knew he had to call someone. But who? The police seemed right. This was an unexplained discovery. A body. He dialed 999, his voice cracking as he tried to explain to the calm, distant operator what he was looking at. He could barely find the words. "I am by the loch. There is an animal, a creature washed up. A huge one. I do not know what it is. You need to send someone. You need to see this." The first to arrive was Police Constable Ewan Grant, from the Fort Augustus station. Grant, a young officer who had transferred up from Glasgow for a quieter life, arrived expecting to find a dead stag, or perhaps a cow, that had fallen into the water. He greeted Angus with a weary but professional air, prepared to deal with a minor rural incident. Angus simply pointed his torch towards the shore. Constable Grant walked towards the carcass, his expression shifting from detached professionalism to utter disbelief. He stopped a few feet from it, his torch beam tracing the same impossible outline Angus had. He was silent for a full minute, the only sounds the lapping water and the crackle of his radio. He walked the perimeter of the creature, his boots crunching on the stones. Finally, he turned back to Angus, his face pale in the gloom. "In all my life," he said, his voice barely audible, "I have never seen anything like it." Within the hour, the quiet cove was transformed. A formal police cordon was established with bright blue and white tape, an incongruous splash of modernity against the primeval scene. Officials from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency arrived, their white vans parked awkwardly on the narrow road. They were followed by a team from the Scottish Marine Animal Stranding Scheme, scientists accustomed to dealing with dead whales and dolphins, who now stood staring at a creature that defied all their field guides and expertise. The news, as it always does in such cases, did not stay contained for long. A junior SEPA employee, overwhelmed by the sight, sent a heavily compressed photo to his brother. From there, it hit social media. Within 3 hours of Angus MacLeod's call, the hashtag Nessie is real was trending worldwide. The low-quality, blurry photo, showing a long neck and a huge, dark body on a misty shore, was enough to ignite a global firestorm of speculation. By midday, the B852 was clogged with traffic. News vans with satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs jostled for position with cars carrying amateur monster hunters, bloggers, and curious onlookers, all hoping for a glimpse of the discovery. Helicopters from major news networks began to circle overhead, their rhythmic chopping a constant intrusion on the somber scientific work that was beginning below. The initial reactions from the scientific community, based on the rapidly circulating images, were predictably divided and cautious. Dr. Isla Campbell, a professor of marine biology at the University of Aberdeen, was one of the first experts to be interviewed. Speaking from her lab, she urged restraint. What we have is a classic globster, an unidentified organic mass that washes ashore, she explained, her tone measured and skeptical. In almost all documented cases, these have turned out to be the heavily decomposed remains of known animals. Most commonly, a basking shark, whose jaw and gill structures can rot away to leave a deceptively plesiosaur-like shape. It could also be a whale, or even a conglomeration of several smaller animals tangled in debris. The public must let the scientific process unfold before jumping to any extraordinary conclusions. But for the cryptozoology community, this was not a globster. This was vindication. Dr. Alistair Finch, a controversial but respected author who had dedicated 40 years to researching the Loch Ness phenomenon, was emotional in his first televised statement. "For decades, we have been ridiculed," he said, standing in front of a wall of books on the subject. "We have been called charlatans and fantasists. But the evidence has always been there, in the eyewitness accounts, the sonar readings, the inexplicable photographs. And now, the loch has given up its dead. The photos clearly show a long neck, a bulky body, and 4 flippers. This is the morphology of a plesiosaur, a creature science tells us died out 65 million years ago. Well, science was wrong. Back at the loch, the team from Scottish Marine Animal Stranding Scheme was conducting a preliminary examination. The site was challenging. The rising tide threatened to reclaim the carcass, and the advanced state of decay made it fragile. They took samples of the skin, blubber, and what little muscle tissue remained. They photographed and measured every angle, their movements precise and methodical amidst the growing media circus on the road above. The decision was quickly made. The carcass had to be moved, and moved carefully to a secure facility for a full necropsy. A low loader truck with a crane was called in. As dusk began to fall, casting long, deep shadows across the water, the operation to lift the creature began. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights, heavy straps were carefully slipped beneath the massive decomposing body. The crane whirred to life, and slowly, painstakingly, the thing that had washed up from the depths of Loch Ness was lifted from the shore. For a moment, it was silhouetted against the darkening sky, a monstrous, impossible shape, dripping dark water back into the loch from which it came. The world watched, holding its breath. For the first time, the mystery of Loch Ness was not a blurry photo or a fleeting shadow. It was tangible. It was flesh and bone. And it was now on its way to a laboratory, where science would be asked to provide an answer, once and for all, to the question that has haunted this dark water for centuries. What is in the loch? The investigation had just begun. The removal of the carcass from the shores of Loch Ness on October 28, 2021, marked a profound shift in a story that had, until that point, been written only in water, shadow, and eyewitness testimony. As the unidentified creature was transported under guard to a secure research facility in Aberdeen, the central question was no longer simply a matter of belief, but of biology. Yet, to understand the seismic impact of this physical specimen, one must first journey back through the centuries of myth and anecdotal evidence that created its legend. The creature on the slab, whatever it was, did not exist in a vacuum. It was the potential answer to a question that has echoed through the Scottish Highlands for more than 1,000 years. The accepted genesis of the legend begins in the 6th century, recorded in the Vita Columbae, or Life of Saint Columba, written a century after the saint's death by the abbot Adamnan of Iona. The text, a hagiography meant to chronicle the saint's miracles, contains a curious and now famous passage. In the year 565, Columba was traveling in the land of the Picts and came upon a group of locals burying a man by the banks of the river Ness, the waterway that flows out of the loch. They told the saint that the man had been attacked and killed while swimming by a nessag, or water beast. Undeterred, Columba instructed one of his followers, a man named Lugne, to swim across the river and retrieve a boat moored on the other side. As Lugne entered the water, Adomnan writes that the beast, stirred up from the bottom, surfaced again. It rushed towards the swimmer with a great roar, and its mouth wide open. While the Picts and Columba's followers were frozen in terror, the saint stepped forward, raised his hand, and made the sign of the cross in the air. He invoked the name of God, commanding the creature, "You will go no further. Do not touch the man. Go back at once." According to Adomnan, at the sound of the saint's voice, the beast was terrified and fled more quickly than if it had been pulled back with ropes. Both Columba's followers and the pagan Picts gave praise to God for the miracle. For believers, this is Exhibit A, the first documented encounter with the monster of Loch Ness. They argue that Adomnan's account, written relatively close to the time, is a factual report of a real event, demonstrating that a large, aggressive, unknown animal has inhabited these waters for at least 1,500 years. It establishes the creature's ancient lineage, long predating modern hoaxes or mass hysteria. Historians and skeptics, however, offer a different interpretation. They point out that hagiographies were not journalistic accounts. They were religious texts designed to glorify a saint and demonstrate the power of Christianity over the pagan world. Miraculous encounters with dragons, sea serpents, and monsters were a common literary trope in such works. Saint Patrick was said to have driven the snakes from Ireland. Saint George famously slew a dragon. Saint Romanus of Rouen was credited with defeating a gargoyle-like creature called the gargouille. The story of Saint Columba and the water beast, they argue, fits perfectly into this tradition. It was a parable. Columba, the agent of God, tames the wild, pagan forces of nature, symbolized by the beast in the river. It is also noted that the encounter takes place not in the deep, vast loch itself, but in the comparatively shallow and narrow River Ness, making the presence of a large, unknown animal less likely. Adding another layer to the ancient origins are the mysterious Pictish stone carvings found throughout the region. The Picts, the Iron Age people who inhabited this part of Scotland, left behind hundreds of stones intricately carved with symbols. Among the images of eagles, salmon, and abstract designs is a peculiar figure that has captured the attention of monster hunters. It is a strange swimming animal with a long downward curving snout or trunk and two distinct flippers. Some have enthusiastically labeled it the Pictish beast or the swimming elephant, claiming it is a clear artistic rendering of the Loch Ness monster, proof that the creature was a known part of the local fauna. Skeptics counter that the symbol's meaning is lost to time. It could represent a dolphin, a mythical creature like a kelpie or water horse, a common figure in Celtic folklore, or it may not depict an aquatic animal at all. Without a Pictish Rosetta Stone to translate these symbols, its connection to the loch's mystery remains purely speculative. For nearly 1,400 years after St. Columba's alleged miracle, the water beast of the Ness lay dormant, at least in the written record. It remained a creature of local folklore, a fireside tale of kelpies and water horses used to frighten children away from the deep, dark water. The loch itself remained remote, its shores largely inaccessible. Then came the 1930s, and everything changed. The catalyst was civil engineering. In 1933, a new road, the A82, was blasted along the northern shoreline, from Inverness to Fort Augustus. For the first time, it provided an unimpeded, elevated view of the loch's entire 23-mile length. Trees were felled, rock faces were cut away, and the once hidden expanse of water was opened up to the public and the age of the automobile. The monster, it seemed, was ready for its close-up. On May 2, 1933, the Inverness Courier published a short article, with the headline, "Strange Spectacle on Loch Ness." It reported a story from a local hotel owner, Aldi Mackay, who claimed that while driving with her husband, she had seen an enormous animal rolling and plunging on the surface. The paper's correspondent, Alex Campbell, famously used the word monster to describe the sighting, a label that would stick permanently. The modern era of Nessie had begun. The story that truly ignited the global phenomenon came just a few months later. On July 22, 1933, a London businessman named George Spicer and his wife were driving along the northern shore near Doras. As they came over a rise in the road, they were forced to slam on their brakes. In their path, lumbering across the road from the woods towards the loch, was what Spicer would later describe as a most extraordinary form of animal. He described a creature with a long, undulating neck, slightly thicker than an elephant's trunk, and a huge, bulky body. He saw no limbs, but said the body jerked and scrambled across the road. He estimated it was about 25 feet long. In a letter to the Courier, Spicer wrote, "It was a horrible sight, a loathsome sight, like a snail with a long neck." This land sighting was crucial. It suggested an amphibious creature, lending credence to the idea of a surviving prehistoric reptile. The floodgates opened. Sightings became a regular occurrence. The world, mired in the Great Depression, was hungry for a magical distraction, and Loch Ness provided it. Newspapers sent reporters and photographers to set up vigils along the shore. In November 1933, a local man named Hugh Gray, walking home from church, took the first ever photograph of the alleged creature. The resulting image is a chaotic splash of water with an indistinct object at its center. A long swan-like neck and head can be inferred, but the photo is so blurry that it is impossible to be certain. Modern analysis has suggested it could be anything from an otter rolling on the surface to a Labrador dog swimming with a stick in its mouth. At the time, however, it was hailed as photographic proof. Then, in April 1934, came the image that would define the monster for the next 60 years. A highly respected London surgeon, Colonel Robert Kenneth Wilson, was driving along the loch when he reportedly saw a commotion in the water. He grabbed his camera and took 4 photographs. 2 were blank, but 2 captured an object in the water. One of these, which would become known simply as the surgeon's photograph, was electrifying. It depicted, in stark black and white, the elegant, serpentine neck and small head of a creature rising gracefully from the rippling surface of the loch. It was the perfect image of a plesiosaur. Published in the Daily Mail on April 21, 1934, the photograph caused a worldwide sensation. The source was impeccable. A surgeon, a man of science and high social standing. The image was clear, compelling, and seemed to confirm the most fantastic theories. For decades, it stood as the single best piece of evidence for the existence of Nessie. It adorned countless books, documentaries, and magazine articles. It was, however, a complete and total fake. In 1994, 60 years after the photo was taken, 2 men, Christian Spurling and Alistair Boyd, came forward with the truth. Spurling, on his deathbed, confessed that his stepfather, Marmaduke Duke Wetherell, had orchestrated the hoax. Wetherell, a big game hunter, had been hired by the Daily Mail in 1933 to find the monster. He found some strange footprints on the shore and made casts, only to have them publicly humiliated by scientists at the Natural History Museum, who identified them as the tracks of a dried hippopotamus foot, likely from an umbrella stand or ashtray of the type popular with hunters. Seeking revenge on the newspaper that had embarrassed him, Wetherell enlisted Spurling to build a model. Using a 14-inch toy submarine as a base, they sculpted a neck and head out of wood putty. They took the model to a quiet bay on the loch, photographed it, and then used Colonel Wilson as a respectable middleman to lend credibility and passed the photo to the Daily Mail. The most iconic image of the Loch Ness monster was nothing more than a toy in the bathtub. Even before the surgeon's photograph was exposed, the scientific community had been proposing more mundane explanations for the sightings. The prevailing theory for a biological candidate was a plesiosaur, a marine reptile that supposedly died out with the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. Superficially, the descriptions matched. The long neck, bulky body, and presumed flippers fit the fossil record. But the biological and environmental hurdles are immense. Loch Ness is a geologically young body of water, formed by glacial action only around 10,000 years ago. It would have been a frozen block of ice during the last ice age, making it impossible for a line of plesiosaurs to have survived there from the Mesozoic era. Furthermore, as air-breathing reptiles, a population of plesiosaurs would need to surface regularly, making them far more frequently seen. Reptiles are also largely cold-blooded, and the loch's average temperature is a frigid 5.5 degrees Celsius, 42 degrees Fahrenheit, an environment in which such a creature would struggle to survive. Finally, and perhaps most damningly, a single monster cannot exist. For a species to be viable, a breeding population is required, likely numbering in the dozens, if not hundreds, of individuals. A population of that size in a contained body of water like Loch Ness would be impossible to miss, and the loch's biomass, the total weight of all living organisms, primarily Arctic char and trout, is believed by most biologists to be insufficient to support a large population of apex predators. This long and tangled history, of saints and hoaxes, of sincere eyewitnesses and scientific impossibilities, is the essential context for the discovery in 2021. For nearly a century, the evidence has been anecdotal, visual, and intensely personal, leaving it vulnerable to misinterpretation, wishful thinking, and outright fraud. Each blurry photo, each sonar blip, each eyewitness account has been a single, isolated piece of a puzzle with no verifiable anchor. But the carcass on the shore was different. It promised to be the anchor, a piece of physical reality that could finally validate or invalidate the entirety of the legend that came before it. The revelation in the 1990s that the surgeon's photograph was an elaborate hoax dealt a devastating blow to the credibility of the Loch Ness phenomenon. For many, it retroactively cast a pall of doubt over every other piece of evidence, suggesting the entire legend was built on a foundation of lies and wishful thinking. Yet, to dismiss the mystery of the loch because of one, albeit iconic, fraud is to ignore the vast and compelling tapestry of evidence that has accumulated over the better part of a century. This evidence, falling into the distinct categories of eyewitness testimony and technological detection, forms the core of the modern case for an unknown animal. While the carcass lay in a refrigerated facility in Aberdeen awaiting examination, its significance could only be measured against the weight of these prior, deeply personal and tantalizingly incomplete encounters. The bedrock of the phenomenon has always been the eyewitness. Thousands of people, from sober, lifelong locals to fleeting tourists, have reported seeing something inexplicable in the water. While many sightings can be easily dismissed, misidentified boats, birds, seals or otters, unusual wave patterns, or the tricks played by light on a vast dark surface, a persistent and consistent core of accounts remains. These are the sightings that defy simple explanation, often made by credible observers in ideal conditions. One such witness is Ewan Grant, a retired ghillie or fishing guide, who spent over 50 years on the loch. A man with a deep practical understanding of the water's moods and its known inhabitants, Grant was famously taciturn on the subject of the monster, viewing it as a distraction from the loch's real wonders. But in a rare interview in 2018, he recounted an event from the autumn of 1986. He had been out in his boat in Urquhart Bay on a perfectly calm, glassy morning. There was no wind, no other boats, just the silence of the Great Glen. "I was not looking for anything," he recalled, his voice a low Highland burr. "Just checking my lines." Then, about 300 yards out, the water broke. It was not a splash, more like a welling up from below. First one, then another, then a third. 3 humps, smooth and black, like the back of a great eel, but much, much bigger around. They moved in a line, steady, against the slight drift of the current. I know what a line of otters looks like, and this was not that. This was one single body, undulating. It moved for perhaps a minute, heading towards the center of the loch, and then it just sank. The water flattened out, and it was gone. I never said a word about it for 20 years. People think you are mad, or you have been drinking. But I know what I saw. It was a living thing, a big living thing. Grant's account is a classic humps sighting, one of the most common types reported. It aligns with hundreds of others, describing a large, dark animal moving with serpentine grace at the surface. Another key category of sighting is the long neck. In August of 1997, Dr. Arlene Vance, a sedimentologist from Cambridge University, was on a geological survey near the ruins of Urquhart Castle. She was a scientist, trained to observe and record with dispassionate accuracy. She was taking notes on the shoreline geology when a movement in the water caught her peripheral vision. "My initial thought was a cormorant, or another large diving bird," she stated in a signed affidavit for a research group, but it was the wrong shape. "What I saw was a slender, pole-like object, perhaps 4 to 5 feet of it, breaking the surface. It was a dark gray or brown color. It was not a log. I am quite familiar with how debris floats. This object moved with a distinct fluid grace. It held its position for no more than 10 seconds, and then it submerged vertically, without a splash. It was as if it was being withdrawn straight down into the water. The most striking feature was the way it moved. It gave the impression of a periscope, but it was organic. As a scientist, I am deeply uncomfortable with drawing conclusions beyond the data, but I can state with certainty that I observed an animate object in Loch Ness that I cannot identify with any known animal." These individual accounts, powerful as they are often easier for skeptics to dismiss than our group sightings. In July of 2012, the Henderson family from Manchester were staying in a holiday cottage overlooking Borlam Bay near Fort Augustus. At around 7 in the morning, David Henderson was in the kitchen making coffee when he saw a disturbance in the calm water. He called his wife Sarah and their 2 teenage children. For nearly 3 minutes, all 4 of them watched as a large, dark shape, which they estimated to be at least 20 feet in length, swam just beneath the surface, its path clearly visible as a V-shaped wake. It never fully broke the surface, but its bulk and movement were unambiguous. It was like watching a small submarine, Sarah Henderson later told a local newspaper. It was methodical, powerful. We were all completely silent, just watching in awe. To have 4 people see the exact same thing at the same time, it eliminates the idea that your eyes are playing tricks on you. As compelling as these eyewitness accounts are, they remain anecdotal. To get closer to the truth, investigators knew they needed to peer beneath the loch's impenetrable surface. The water of Loch Ness is famously dark, its visibility often less than a few feet, due to a high concentration of suspended peat particles. This blackout curtain makes visual exploration impossible, forcing researchers to turn to sound, sonar. The first serious systematic attempts to use sonar to find the creature were conducted by the Loch Ness Investigation Bureau, LNIB, throughout the 1960s. They obtained several tantalizing sonar contacts with large moving objects in the mid-water, but the technology was primitive by modern standards, and the results were ultimately inconclusive. The game changed in the 1970s with the arrival of Dr. Robert Rines, an American patent lawyer inventor, and a professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Rines brought a new level of scientific rigor and advanced technology to the search. His strategy was to combine sonar with automated, remotely triggered underwater cameras. In August of 1972, Rines's team was working in Urquhart Bay when their sonar picked up a large object. The underwater strobe camera, loaded with high-speed ectochrome film, fired. When the film was developed, the images were murky and indistinct. However, Rines took them to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, where technicians used advanced pre-digital computer enhancement techniques. The same technology was used to clarify images from NASA's space probes. The result was astonishing. One image, now famously known as the flipper photo, appeared to show a large rhomboid appendage, textured like the skin of a whale or elephant seal. Based on the sonar data, the object was estimated to be 6 to 8 feet long. It was tangible, seemingly biological, and of a size that dwarfed any known freshwater animal. 3 years later, in 1975, the Rines expedition returned and captured even more extraordinary images. Again, pairing sonar with underwater photography, they produced 2 key pictures. The first, nicknamed the gargoyle head, shows what appears to be the head, long neck, and upper torso of a large animal. The head is horned, or has bony protuberances, and the mouth is slightly agape. The second photo seems to show the full body and neck of a plesiosaur-like creature. For a time it seemed the mystery was solved. The scientific journal Nature even published an article on the findings, and the creature was given a provisional scientific name, Nessiteras rhombopteryx, meaning the Ness wonder with the diamond-shaped fin. The Rines photos, however, exist in a state of permanent controversy. Skeptics have argued that the enhancement process at Jet Propulsion Laboratory may have introduced details not present in the original murky images. They contend the flipper could be a collection of air bubbles or the bottom sediments of the loch, and the gargoyle head nothing more than a gnarled ancient tree stump that has since moved. Without the original object to compare, the photos remain a tantalizing but unproven piece of evidence. The largest scale sonar investigation of the loch was undertaken in 1987. Dubbed Operation Deepscan, the project was the brainchild of Adrian Shine, a naturalist and the leader of the Loch Ness and Morar project. Shine's approach was methodical and skeptical, aimed at surveying the entire loch for any unusual phenomena. For 2 days, a fleet of 24 boats motored in a tight, parallel formation from one end of the loch to the other, sweeping the depths with a continuous curtain of sound. The results were electrifying. The fleet registered 3 separate, solid sonar contacts with a large, unidentified object that was, in Shine's words, larger than a shark and smaller than a whale. On one occasion, the object was detected by multiple boats simultaneously. It was holding its position deep in the water column near Urquhart Castle. When one of the boats broke formation to move in for a closer look, the object seemed to react. It descended rapidly towards the bottom and disappeared into the underwater cliffs and canyons that line the loch floor. Shine, ever the cautious scientist, has never claimed that Deepscan found a monster. He simply states the facts. They detected a large, moving, animate object in the loch that they could not explain. In the digital era, video and satellite imagery have taken center stage. In 2007, a lab technician named Gordon Holmes, using a high-quality camcorder from a lay-by on the A82, captured 2 minutes of clear footage. It shows a long, black, serpentine shape, roughly 45 feet in length, powering through the water at an estimated 6 miles per hour, leaving a distinct wake. The footage was analyzed by marine biologists and video experts, who ruled out seals, otters, and boat wakes, concluding it was an unidentified living creature. Conversely, the pitfalls of modern technology were highlighted in 2014, when an Apple Maps satellite photo appeared to show a huge, plesiosaur-shaped creature swimming just south of doors. The image went viral, but was quickly debunked by experts who demonstrated it was the ghost wake of a pleasure boat. The boat itself had been in a previous satellite pass and was digitally erased, but its wake remained, creating the illusion of a large, submerged object. This is the complex legacy of evidence that confronted the scientists in Aberdeen as they prepared for the necropsy. It is a legacy of sincere human observation, of compelling but ambiguous technological data, and of outright hoaxes. For every Gordon Holmes video, there is an Apple Maps illusion. For every Ewan Grant, there is the shadow of the surgeon's photograph. The carcass that was dragged from the shore promised something different, a final, definitive data point. It would either provide a physical, biological explanation for these fleeting encounters, a known animal whose decomposing form could be mistaken for a monster, or it would confirm that the sonar blips, the moving humps, and the serpentine necks were glimpses of a creature that had, until now, successfully eluded capture. The moment of truth was at hand. The scalpels were being sterilized. While the world's media and a hopeful public debated the possibilities, the carcass itself had arrived at its final destination, a state-of-the-art veterinary pathology unit at the University of Aberdeen. Here, far from the mist-shrouded mystique of the Loch, the creature entered a world of sterile stainless steel, refrigerated rooms, and the cold, empirical logic of forensic science. The team assembled to perform the necropsy was led by Dr. Helena Jensen, a Danish marine biologist and the head of the Scottish Marine Animal Stranding Scheme. A woman known for her meticulous, no-nonsense approach, Jensen had personally examined the remains of hundreds of whales, dolphins, and sharks. For her, this was not a monster. It was a biological puzzle, and she had the tools to solve it. The atmosphere in the large, brightly lit necropsy suite was one of focused anticipation. The creature lay on a massive, custom-built examination table, its immense bulk and the pervasive odor of decay, a strange organic intrusion in the otherwise clinical environment. The first phase of the investigation was a detailed external examination. Dr. Jensen and her team, clad in waterproof coveralls, gloves, and masks, began the slow, methodical process of documenting every feature. Measurements were taken first. The total length, from the tip of the skeletal head to the end of the tail, was 7.8 meters, or just over 25 feet. The central torso had a circumference of nearly 4 meters. These figures alone placed it among the largest aquatic animals ever seen in a freshwater environment in the British Isles. As they worked, the team systematically addressed the features that had so excited the public. The long, slender neck was examined with intense scrutiny. It was not a distinct, muscular structure like that of a reptile or mammal. Instead, it was found to be the upper portion of a continuous spinal column, with degraded muscle and connective tissue clinging to it. The small, equine head was almost entirely bone and cartilage, stripped of flesh. Probing revealed that it was not a skull in the conventional sense, but a chondrocranium, the cartilaginous brain case characteristic of sharks and rays. Next came the 4 large flippers. They were indeed broad and paddle-like, but upon closer inspection, they lacked any internal bone structure. No digits, no wrist or ankle joints, the kind one would expect to find in a marine reptile like a plesiosaur. They were composed of cartilage rays, known as ceratotrichia, which support the fins of sharks. Their size and shape were consistent with the pectoral and pelvic fins of a very large fish. The skin, which witnesses had described as smooth or reptilian, was found to be a complex, decaying mess. Where it remained intact, it was rough and sandpaper-like, covered in tiny, tooth-like placoid scales, a defining characteristic of elasmobranch, which are sharks and rays. In other areas, the outer layers had rotted away exposing a thick mat of dermal fibers beneath. This fibrous layer, when decomposing, can often resemble coarse hair or fur, a feature noted in many historical lobster cases. For Dr. Jensen and her team, a clear and familiar pattern was beginning to emerge. The evidence was pointing strongly towards a classic, well-documented phenomenon of marine decomposition. She called her team together, away from the carcass. "Before we make a single incision," she announced, her voice clear and direct, "we must address the primary hypothesis. Everything we are seeing externally is consistent with the post-mortem decomposition of a Nessiteras maximus." Nessiteras maximus is the scientific name for the basking shark. It is the second largest living fish, after the whale shark, capable of reaching lengths of over 10 meters. It is a filter feeder, found in temperate oceans worldwide, including the waters off the coast of Scotland. Though enormous, it is a placid, slow-moving creature that poses no threat to humans. Crucially, its unique anatomy makes its decomposing carcass a perfect candidate for a sea serpent or plesiosaur misidentification. The process, which has been documented by scientists for over a century, is a dramatic act of biological transformation. A basking shark has an enormous mouth and a highly complex gill structure designed to filter plankton from the water. Upon death, the body sinks. As decomposition begins, the most weakly attached and softest parts are the first to go. The entire lower jaw, a huge scoop-like structure of soft cartilage, detaches and falls away. The massive gill arches the intricate baskets that support the gills also rot and slow off. The result is that the most recognizable parts of the shark's head simply disappear. What remains is the much smaller, more durable brain case and the long vertebral column to which it is attached. To the untrained eye, this looks exactly like a small head on a long serpentine neck. The shark's large pectoral and dorsal fins can also remain, appearing like the humps or flippers of a mythical beast. The skeleton is made entirely of cartilage, which decays differently from bone, often allowing the carcass to maintain a fleshy, sea monster appearance for longer. This explanation, Dr. Jensen explained to her team, accounted for almost every plesiosaur carcass ever washed ashore, from the Stronsay beast of 1808 to the famous Zuio Maru carcass dredged up by a Japanese fishing trawler off New Zealand in 1977. With this powerful skeptical framework in place, the internal examination began. The moment of the first incision was a point of no return. A long, heavy-bladed scalpel was drawn down the length of the torso. The decaying blubber and muscle tissue parted, revealing the body cavity. The internal organs were in an advanced state of liquefaction, making individual identification difficult. However, there were key structures to look for. The team searched for any sign of lungs, the air-breathing organs of a reptile or mammal. They found none. Instead, deep within the chest cavity, they located the degraded but unmistakable filaments of massive gills. This was the anatomy of a fish, a water breather. The team then turned its attention to the stomach, a vast, sac-like organ. Carefully, they sluiced its semi-liquid contents through a series of fine meshes. There were no fish bones, no seal remains, no evidence of a large predator. The contents consisted of a thick, reddish-brown slurry of partially digested copepods and other microscopic crustaceans. This was the classic diet of a filter-feeding basking shark. The final, definitive piece of physical evidence was the skeleton itself. As the scientists cut away sections of flesh, they exposed the vertebral column. Dr. Jensen took a small handsaw and cut a cross-section from one of the large vertebrae in the neck. She held it up to the light. It was not the hard, ossified bone of a reptile. It was softer, more flexible, and had the distinct calcified ring pattern of a shark vertebra. The entire skeleton was cartilaginous. There was not a single true bone in its body, aside from the placoid scales in its skin. By the end of the first day of the necropsy, the physical evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous. The creature that had washed ashore on the banks of Loch Ness was not a prehistoric reptile. It was the heavily decomposed carcass of a very large basking shark. But this conclusion raised its own set of questions, which a thorough scientific investigation had to answer. How did a marine shark, estimated to be around 80 years old based on vertebral ring counts, end up in a freshwater loch? The journey is possible, though difficult. Loch Ness is connected to the sea at both ends via the Caledonian Canal system and the River Ness, which flows into the Moray Firth. It is plausible that an old, sick, or disoriented shark could have strayed from the coast and made its way up the river system. The lower salinity in the river and loch would have been a massive physiological shock to the animal, likely hastening its death. Its body could have then drifted for days or weeks in the cold, deep water before a combination of decompositional gases and currents brought it to the surface and washed it ashore in the cove where Angus MacLeod found it. A secondary possibility was also considered: the Greenland shark, known as Somniosus microcephalus. This species is another giant of the deep, known to inhabit the cold waters of the North Atlantic. They are notoriously elusive, can grow to lengths comparable to the carcass, and possess a high tolerance for varying environmental conditions. While less common in coastal waters than the basking shark, a Greenland shark could not be entirely ruled out on physical examination alone. Both were large, cartilaginous fish. At a press conference held 2 days after the necropsy began, Dr. Jensen presented her team's preliminary findings. She spoke carefully, avoiding sensationalism, and laid out the evidence step by step. Based on a comprehensive morphological examination, she concluded, including skeletal structure, skin type, and respiratory organs, we have concluded that the specimen is the carcass of a large elasmobranch, or cartilaginous fish. All evidence is highly consistent with the known decompositional patterns of a basking shark, Sidorinus maximus. She stressed that DNA analysis was underway to provide absolute confirmation of the species. The reaction from the believer community was immediate and dismissive. Dr. Alistair Finch, the veteran researcher, appeared on a news program that evening. This is precisely the explanation we expected the scientific establishment to provide, he argued, his tone sharp. It is the tidy, convenient answer that allows them to close the book on this. But it does not fit the facts. What about the hundreds of eyewitnesses who describe a creature with mammalian qualities? A smooth-skinned animal that holds its neck high out of the water like a swan. A basking shark cannot do that. It is a fish. Its fins are not flippers capable of amphibious locomotion, as described by George Spicer. This single carcass, this convenient shark, does not and cannot explain the phenomenon. At best, it is an anomaly. At worst, it is a deliberate attempt to mislead the public and put the genie back in the bottle. The battle lines were drawn. On one side was the physical, verifiable, but ultimately mundane evidence of the carcass. On the other was the vast, compelling, but anecdotal evidence of nearly a century of sightings. The scientists in Aberdeen had provided an identity for the body on the shore, but in doing so, they had only deepened the central schism in the Loch Ness debate. They had explained the body, but had they explained the mystery? For many, the answer was a resounding no. All eyes now turned to the final invisible arbiter of the truth, the DNA results, which promised to write the final word on the creature that came ashore. The 2 weeks following the necropsy were a strange, tense interlude in the saga of the shoreline carcass. The body itself, now dissected and sampled, was gone from the public eye, but its identity hung in the balance, suspended between the definitive physical evidence of a shark and the faint persistent hope of an anomaly. Dr. Jensen's press conference had laid out the facts, but without the final confirmation from a genetics lab, her conclusion remained, for some, a theory rather than a verdict. The world waited for the DNA to speak. The tissue samples, small, carefully preserved sections of muscle and skin, had been sent to a specialized ancient DNA research facility at the University of Copenhagen, a lab renowned for its ability to extract viable genetic material from degraded remains. The process is painstaking. DNA, the fundamental blueprint of life, begins to break down immediately after death. It is attacked by enzymes, microbes, and environmental exposure. The sample from the Loch Ness carcass was particularly challenging, having been subject to prolonged immersion in water and significant bacterial decay. In the lab, technicians in sterile cleanroom suits worked to isolate the remaining fragments of mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid. This type of deoxyribonucleic acid, inherited from the mother and found outside the cell's nucleus, is more abundant than nuclear deoxyribonucleic acid and therefore more likely to survive in degraded samples. The team used a technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR, to amplify these tiny surviving fragments, creating millions of copies until there was enough genetic material to be read by a sequencing machine. The resulting genetic code would then be compared against a global database of known species, a process that would deliver a match with near-perfect statistical certainty. On November 15, 2021, the results were sent under secure encryption to Dr. Jensen's team in Aberdeen. A joint press conference was scheduled for the following day to be held at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. The choice of venue was symbolic, signaling that this announcement was a matter of serious scientific importance. Dr. Jensen stood at the podium, flanked by Dr. Klaus Richter, the head of the Copenhagen Genetics Lab, who appeared via video link. The room was packed with journalists from around the world. Jensen began by summarizing the necropsy findings, reiterating the overwhelming morphological evidence that had pointed them towards a large shark. Then, she handed over to Dr. Richter. "The DNA evidence is unambiguous," the geneticist stated, his voice clear and devoid of drama. "We were able to successfully sequence multiple fragments of the cytochrome C oxidase I gene, a standard marker used for DNA barcoding in vertebrates. We compared these sequences to the GenBank database. We have a 99.97% genetic match to Nessiteras maximus, the basking shark. We can also definitively rule out a Greenland shark or any other known species. The animal that washed ashore in Loch Ness was, without any scientific doubt, a male basking shark." The words, clinical and final, seemed to suck the air out of the room. There was no room for interpretation, no statistical anomaly to cling to. The monster was a shark. The myth had met the full, unblinking glare of modern genetic science, and the result was mundane. For the scientific community, it was the final, satisfying click of a puzzle piece falling into place. It was a textbook case of a globster identification, a modern triumph for the scientific method. The story was over. But for those who had spent their lives captivated by the mystery, the DNA result was not an end, but an infuriating diversion. Dr. Alistair Finch was besieged by reporters. His response was a masterclass in shifting the goalposts. "Of course it is a shark," he said, standing on the pavement outside his home. "A shark that has no business being in Loch Ness. The question is not what it was, the question is how it got there. Did it swim up the River Ness? An 8-meter shark, navigating a shallow, narrow river system, through a canal lock, unseen by anyone. It seems highly improbable. To me, this result only deepens the mystery." Within days, new theories bloomed across internet forums and social media. The most prominent was the red herring theory, that the carcass had been deliberately planted. Proponents of this idea suggested that a powerful, clandestine group, perhaps a government agency or a private corporation, wanted to quell the monster phenomenon for their own reasons, maybe to allow for secret industrial or military use of the loch. They had, the theory went, procured a shark carcass and deposited it on the shore for a lone local to find, knowing the scientific establishment would seize upon it as the final answer, thus discrediting all future sightings. There was, of course, no evidence for this, but it provided a narrative that allowed belief to survive in the face of inconvenient facts. Angus MacLeod, the man who started it all, was more philosophical. Speaking to a local journalist from his cottage, he looked out towards the water. "I believe the scientists. They are clever folk. So, it was a shark. But I will tell you this, seeing that thing, lying there in the dawn, it felt like something from another time. A shark in the loch is nearly as strange as a monster, is it not? It tells you that the water keeps its secrets. It tells you that you never know what might turn up." Just as the story of the carcass seemed to be fading, a new chapter in the scientific exploration of the loch was brought to the forefront, one that ironically offered a more compelling, evidence-based alternative for a potential monster than a plesiosaur ever had. In 2018, 3 years before the carcass washed ashore, a major international research project had been conducted, led by Professor Neil Gemmell of the University of Otago in New Zealand. Gemmell was a pioneer in the field of environmental DNA or eDNA. The concept of eDNA is revolutionary. Every living organism constantly sheds genetic material into its environment: skin cells, scales, mucus, feces, urine. This genetic detritus floats in the water like a biological dust. By collecting water samples and sequencing the DNA within them, scientists can create a comprehensive census of all the species living in an ecosystem without ever needing to see or catch a single animal. It is a powerful tool for biodiversity monitoring and the detection of rare or invasive species. Gemmell and his team collected 250 water samples from various locations and depths all over Loch Ness. Their goal was to catalog the loch's life in its entirety and, in the process, to see if they could find any DNA that did not fit. Was there any reptile DNA that might point to a plesiosaur, any shark DNA, or perhaps a sequence so strange it belonged to a species unknown to science? The results, published in 2019, were fascinating. They found the DNA of humans, dogs, sheep, and cattle from the surrounding farms. They found DNA from badgers, deer, voles, and numerous bird species. In the water, they found the expected trout, salmon, and Arctic char. They found no DNA from sturgeon or catfish, 2 other large fish candidates for monster sightings. They found absolutely no shark DNA, a fact that made the 2021 basking shark incident even more remarkable, confirming it as a freak, one-off event. Most importantly for the legend, they found not a single shred of reptile DNA. The plesiosaur theory, already biologically untenable, was now genetically dead. But they did find one thing in extraordinary abundance: eel DNA. It was everywhere, Gemmell explained in a lecture. Every sample we took, from the surface to the deepest parts of the loch, was packed with the DNA of the European eel, Anguilla anguilla. The European eel has a remarkable life cycle. It is born in the Sargasso Sea, drifts across the Atlantic as a larva, and enters European river systems, including the Ness, as a young elver. It lives its adult life in freshwater, growing for years before migrating back to the Sargasso Sea to spawn and die. Normally, they grow to a length of 2 to 3 feet. Gemmell, however, floated a speculative but intriguing hypothesis. Is it possible, he asked, that some of these eels, for hormonal or genetic reasons, become sterile? Unable to make the final journey back to the sea, could they remain in the loch, continuing to grow for 50 years or more, reaching a truly exceptional size. A 10% increase in length results in a much larger increase in mass. A 4 or 5 meter eel would be a very large, powerful animal. When it comes to the surface, it would be a long, serpentine shape. It fits many of the eyewitness descriptions. The giant eel theory was not new. It had been a leading skeptical explanation for decades. But Gemmel's eDNA research provided the first hard, quantitative data to support it. There was a huge population of eels in the loch, providing a biologically plausible source for the sightings. This hypothesis elegantly bypassed the problems of the plesiosaur theory. Eels are known inhabitants. They require no breeding population of giant individuals, just a few abnormal ones. Their serpentine appearance matches many accounts. The theory could not explain hump or land sightings, but it could account for a significant portion of the phenomenon. This new scientific development completely reshaped the landscape of the mystery. The shoreline carcass of 2021 had served as a definitive full stop on the idea of a prehistoric monster. It was a case of mistaken identity, writ large. However, the eDNA survey had, in the same breath, opened a new, more plausible avenue of inquiry. The question was no longer, is there a plesiosaur in Loch Ness? It was now, just how big can the eels in Loch Ness get? The focus of the search had shifted from a mythical reptile to a biological anomaly. The mystery had not been solved. It had simply evolved into a more refined and perhaps even more fascinating scientific question. The revelation that the creature washed ashore on the banks of Loch Ness was a basking shark was a moment of scientific clarity, a definitive empirical full stop on a dramatic chapter of the legend. For many, it was the end of the story. The monster had been identified, the mystery solved. A mundane biological process, death and decay, had been mistaken for the supernatural. Yet, to close the book on the phenomenon because of one misidentified carcass is to mistake the answering of a single question for the solving of the entire puzzle. The 2021 incident was not an end. It was a reckoning. It stripped away the most fanciful layers of the myth, and in doing so, forced a renewed focus on the core, tangible elements of the mystery, creating a clearer, more profound schism between what science can explain and what human experience continues to report. The carcass represents the triumph of the skeptical viewpoint. It is the ultimate case study in how the loch can deceive. It proves, with the certainty of deoxyribonucleic acid, that an ordinary animal, transformed by the strange alchemy of decomposition, can perfectly mimic the form of a prehistoric monster. Every feature that so excited the public, the long neck, the small head, the powerful flippers, was an illusion, a post-mortem artifact. This single event provides a powerful, tangible explanation for generations of similar sea serpent carcasses found around the world. It validates the argument that many sightings, particularly those of strange forms lying on the shore or floating inertly in the water, are likely misidentified remains of known animals. The basking shark, in its death, became the perfect monster, a testament to nature's ability to create mythological forms without the need for any unknown species. It was a sobering dose of reality, a reminder that the most sensational explanation is rarely the correct one. Had the carcass been the only major development, the legend might have finally receded into folklore. But it arrived in the wake of another, equally powerful scientific investigation, Professor Neil Gemmel's environmental DNA survey. While the carcass debunked the plesiosaur, the environmental DNA results provided a compelling, biologically plausible candidate for at least a portion of the sightings, the giant eel. The sheer volume of eel DNA found throughout the loch was staggering, confirming a massive population. Gemmel's hypothesis that a small number of sterile eels could remain in the loch and grow to extraordinary sizes provided a scientific framework for the classic long neck and serpentine hump sightings. It required no prehistoric survivals, no breeding populations of monsters, only a biological anomaly within a known species. Together, the basking shark and the giant eel theory form the twin pillars of the modern scientific explanation for the Loch Ness monster. The shark explains the dead monsters, while the eel explains many of the living ones. They are the neat, rational answers that satisfy the demands of scientific inquiry. They account for a vast percentage of the evidence, consigning much of it to the realms of misidentification and biological abnormality. And yet, for some, they are not enough. The mystery endures in the margins, in the eyewitness accounts that these tidy explanations cannot fully contain. Would a 5-meter eel, however large, create the great upheaval in the water described by Aldie Mackay in 1933? Does it account for the sheer bulk, the body the width of the road, that George Spicer and his wife saw crossing in front of their car? Does a giant eel have a gargoyle head with horns, as suggested by the controversial Rines photograph? Does it explain the multiple distinct humps moving in unison, as witnessed by Ewan Grant, the veteran ghillie? This is the enduring heart of the Loch Ness mystery, the conflict between scientific plausibility and sincere, inexplicable human experience. Science, rightly, builds its case on verifiable, repeatable data. The carcass provided that. The environmental DNA provided that. But eyewitness testimony, while fallible, is also a form of data. When hundreds of credible, sober individuals, separated by decades, report seeing things that do not neatly fit the provided explanations, their collective experience cannot be dismissed out of hand. They may all be mistaken, but the consistency of their mistakes is, in itself, a phenomenon worth investigating. Perhaps the true monster is the loch itself. It is a place uniquely engineered to create a legend. 23 miles long, over 750 feet deep in places, it holds more fresh water than all the lakes of England and Wales combined. Its water is dark, stained brown with peat, a blackout curtain that renders sight useless just a few feet below the surface. Its sheer, steep underwater cliffs, mapped by sonar, create a complex, hidden topography where a large animal could easily evade detection. It is a vast, dark, cold, and intimidating environment, a landscape that feels primeval. The human mind is hardwired to populate such voids with monsters. We are pattern-seeking animals, and on the shifting light-dappled surface of Loch Ness, the brain can conjure a beast from a boat wake, a line of cormorants, or the strange waves created by wind patterns funneling down the Great Glen. The legend is also sustained by the profound human desire for the unknown. In a world that is increasingly mapped, measured, and explained, Loch Ness remains a pocket of defiance. It represents the possibility that not all the dragons have been slain, that there are still mysteries left to be discovered. This yearning is powerful. It fuels the multi-million-pound tourist industry. It inspires amateur investigators to spend their holidays scanning the water, and it makes people want to believe. The carcass, in this context, was a threat, an unwelcome intrusion of the mundane into a world of cherished enchantment. The 2021 incident has irrevocably changed the nature of the search. The serious, scientifically minded investigators are no longer looking for a plesiosaur. The carcass and the eDNA study have rendered that search obsolete. Today, the quest has become more nuanced, more scientific. Researchers like Adrian Shine continue their work, not as monster hunters, but as limnologists, studying the complex ecosystem of the loch. The new Holy Grail is not a monster, but a specimen of a truly giant European eel, an animal that would be a scientific marvel in its own right. The legend has, in a way, become a catalyst for legitimate ecological discovery. In the final analysis, the creature that came ashore was both an ending and a beginning. It was the definitive end of the plesiosaur hypothesis, a final biological grounding of a myth. But it was also the beginning of a new, more focused era of inquiry. The question is no longer, is there a monster in Loch Ness? But rather, what are the true biological limits of this unique and mysterious environment? The science tells us the body on the shore was a shark. It tells us the water is full of eels. It offers rational explanations for strange wakes and fleeting glimpses. But it cannot fully explain the conviction in a witness's voice, nor can it entirely tame the primal sense of wonder and fear that the dark water inspires. The Loch Ness Monster is not a single creature waiting to be captured. It is a complex, shifting entity, an amalgam of misidentified sharks, potentially giant eels, optical illusions, and the profound, enduring human need for mystery. The body has been identified. However, the spirit of the loch, the powerful idea that something ancient and unknown still slips through the peat-black abyss, remains very much at large.